You're listening to Nurture Your Zest. I'm your host, Ashleigh King, and I will introduce you to a wealth of interesting, fascinating individuals from all walks of life who will share their stories, how they've overcome challenges, and you will find out their top tips for success. Through this podcast, you can gain tips to grow and change your life and the way you see the world, and help you to nurture your zest. Hello everyone, today I'm joined by Gareth. I'm so excited to have you here today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, so I'm Gareth Longstaff. I work at Newcastle University.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to have you here today because there's lots of great things that you're involved in. This is actually a special episode today for World AIDS Day, which is taking place the 1st of December. So it's really nice to actually have someone who I can talk to about this because I felt it was a really important event to honour and think about. And I guess we could start by asking, first of all, what does World AIDS Day mean to you?
I think World AIDS Day continues to be one of those kind of, calendar events, if you will, each year, not just for gay men or for people who live with, HIV and AIDS, but for people who, in some ways, everyone is kind of connected to, not just gay life, but LGBTQ life, but also, the kind of the advent, the discourse, the legacy, if you will, of HIV and AIDS. So I think for me, it's a way to mark and to kind of remember, but also to celebrate, I think, kind of those people who have died from HIV and AIDS, but also those people who are living with it. And also, I think it's a really important opportunity as well to contextualize HIV and AIDS. It's a problematic thing, isn't it? That it's such a massive thing. If you think about it at the level of, okay, so this is a kind of diagnostic medical thing. Beyond that diagnostic medical thing, it's a cultural thing. It's a social thing. It affects people, communities, lives, contexts. So I think it's a massively important thing to celebrate and to raise awareness of at a local level, national level, international level. So yeah, for me, it's kind of one of those moments in the year where I feel incredibly proud, but also quite emotional and quite, I would say kind of, I can't really find the word as such, but emotional, and I think connected to the kind of various people who work around and live with or in relation to HIV and AIDS.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And it makes me think of a point, actually. When you spoke about international, I do think it's an international context. And I've always been confused from a young age because growing up in South Africa, I often did community work with many young babies or mothers who had AIDS. So my experience of AIDS was never that it was an LGBT issue until I moved to the UK and started to learn about the history of AIDS and how much stigma there had been both in the UK and the US. So actually it is an international issue for many cultures and many communities. But why do you think it's been such a big part of LGBT life and part of the stigma around it?
I think what you said there is actually really interesting, and it's kind of almost my short-sightedness sitting here as a white gay man in a, advanced kind of economic capitalist, if you will, context, right? I think that that's one version of HIV and AIDS. And again, that's why I don't necessarily apologise for the short-sightedness, but what I'm trying to say is that my response to the previous question is about kind of the structures that I'm working with. And again, you mentioned the South African context, the structures that you're working with. I think that HIV and AIDS has many contexts that need to be acknowledged in actually quite careful ways. So, yes, it affects gay men, but in the West, one could argue, and particularly in the UK, I think that is a fact and it needs to be marked and acknowledged. But then it also affects lots of people who are not gay men, right? So again, the whole discourse of, or the whole continent, and I don't mean to say this in a kind of derogatory or problematic way. But if you think of the African context, it's really far more complex than simply Africa. But if you use that geography, that cultural geography, to then think about the geography of how that's being contextualized in South Africa and then other African countries, AIDS in maybe Central Africa is certainly not the same as it is in, London or Newcastle or wherever. So I think that there are lots of histories to HIV and AIDS. I think it's better to think of that as pluralized in, and again, Western, non-Western contexts, if you want to use that kind of binary. For me, as a white gay man in a kind of, advanced, civilized, capitalist country, sure thing, you are dealing with a very particular and specific history, which by and large, if you are looking at it as a gay male history, it connects also to the emergence of HIV and AIDS in the United States. So again, the US and the UK, there's a very kind of particular trajectory of HIV and AIDS that exists, I think, in relation to, entire communities of gay men that were effectively wiped out in, the 1980s, for example. And there's an awful lot of media representations, songs, books, films, TV shows, which document that. That's amazing. Okay. But again, I think that is one version of a much more complex history or histories. So again, it's kind of, we maybe get onto that, but it's about, how, for instance, in the UK and the US, if we're looking at medication which can effectively kind of, manage or cancel out HIV, antibodies and viruses, then yeah, that's not the case maybe in different geographies. So it's a really good point to make. Yeah.
It's true. And actually, the medication in Africa can be really hard to come by and very expensive to buy. One thing that I've realized through people I've met who have HIV, whether in the UK, in the Western world or in Africa, is that there is this shame attached with HIV, regardless of where you are, where you're based, what you're going through. It's deeply shameful. And for many of the children I've worked with, for example, they are born into shame, and it's almost like a something they carry over their life from birth, and it has so much power. And it's really scary, actually, how powerful shame can be. And it's only really through reaching out and having conversations that are difficult and hard sometimes, and talking about things, that sometimes that shame can be lifted. But there is a real strong sense of shame. I think it's deeply sad to see those who have passed away and who have been lost. Some of the greatest performers, we were just talking before we started recording about Freddie Mercury, whose birthday was yesterday. What an incredible performer, magnetizing stage presence and charisma. My personal favorite, actually, Rudolf Nureyev, the ballet dancer, who was iconic. It's incredible. As you were saying, whole communities of young men wiped out. What was that like for you growing up as a gay male? For you coming out of the closet and telling family that you were gay, how did they cope with that? Did you have your family worrying about HIV, or did you have friends and community members almost putting their fears onto you and projecting them onto you?
Okay, there's a lot to consider here, but I think I'll try my best. Again, I've been scribbling down a couple of points. I think if we start with shame, and if we start with this idea of shame, and I think shame is always connected to secrecy and to not being able to speak or being kind of silenced. So this idea that we self-shame because we interiorize our emotions and we can't affirm who we are, we can't say who we are. So again, if you're that African child, or if you're that young man who has just been diagnosed as HIV positive, there is a level of shame, particularly because I think the kind of, the ghettoization, if you like, if that's a term I can use, of AIDS and HIV, particularly in the 1980s in the UK and the US, was connected to a kind of like a almost like a double whammy of shame, you know, sexual shame because you have contracted this disease, which is by and large being kind of badged as a sexual disease, or a disease which you catch because you're using dirty needles, this kind of thing, right? So shame, 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 amplified shame. And then the shame of the closet, or the shame of, okay, I haven't come out yet, I've contracted HIV, I'm completely ashamed of, and I don't know why I'm ashamed of, my sexuality and my sexual practices, which have got me to this state, this place, right? I think that in itself, so I was born 1979, so again, I'm not, you know, a person that lived through the AIDS crisis as such. You know, I came out when I was 19, so 1998. And again, there was a whole movement, and I've been very, you know, sometimes history and time is fortunate to people, and I feel very fortunate for the kind of periodization that I was born into. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say there is that, you know, during the 1980s, for example, that kind of closet or that way of feeling ashamed was incredibly real for a lot of people. By the time I came out in the late 90s, there was a move towards a more empowering way or affirming way of actually negotiating and presenting yourself as an HIV positive person, for example, right? And I'm really glad to see, particularly, you know, on, for instance, social media, or, you know, I think social media gets a bad rap sometimes, and I think it can be quite an affirming space, you know, to actually say, well, we're actually, you know, for example, if we're a community, if we were a community of HIV positive people together, wherever, whenever, whatever, we're negotiating and we're celebrating this, we're empowering ourselves actually. So shame is kind of not even part of the picture here. It is what it is. This is what we're working with. That's took decades, you know, and again, I'm speaking, and I really want to kind of emphasize that today in this podcast, that I'm speaking as well as from a place of kind of cultural privilege, when you can freely say, well, I'm not ashamed to have HIV or AIDS, and you can use that as a way to promote awareness. That's really important. Just one example, you mentioned Freddie Mercury and Nureyev, and I scribbled down, I mean, for me, so I'm a scholar of celebrity and celebrity culture. And for me, one of the starkest but most telling kind of examples of HIV and AIDS is in the representation of the movie star Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson died in 1985 at the height, really, one could argue, you know, the kind of eye of the storm of that kind of Reaganist, Thatcherist era, of the hysteria which surrounded HIV and AIDS. Not to get too academic, but, you know, Richard Dyer, who's a film scholar, wrote a fabulous essay not long after Hudson's death in 85 called The Body of Rock Hudson. And this idea that Hudson was gay all of his life, but he was always closeted. So he performed in movies with people like Doris Day, Elizabeth Taylor, this kind of beautiful, chiseled American matinee idol. And he was actually, you know, this gay man. Everyone knew it. It was a kind of unspoken secret in Hollywood, you know. And he basically led his life behind the scenes in the closet as a gay man because he could. He had money, he had privilege, he was a Hollywood star. Cut long story short, Hudson contracts HIV and AIDS and dies quite rapidly, actually. And there's a very, very stark image of him. I think it's on the cover of something like the National Enquirer in the US. It's a kind of tabloidized image of this very gaunt, very ill-looking victim, gay man as AIDS victim. And Dyer does this beautiful job of contrasting this kind of chiseled muscularity from the 1950s, the pre-AIDS body, in relation to this withered, tragic victim that is portrayed in the press as this is what will happen to you if you know, are promiscuous, etc. I think at the same time, I think it was Princess Anne as well gave quite a famous speech. You know, this awfully negative kind of really kind of, you know, a kind of sublimated attack almost on gay men to say, well, you know, if you live your life this way, it's going to happen to you, kind of thing. Thank goodness we're past that, you know. But I think that shame, if we go back to where we were, I've never, thankfully, felt myself. I've always had the tools, the intellectual tools, the emotional tools in myself, but also with my family and my friends and, you know, the kind of stuff that I do, never to feel ashamed. You know, I'm not HIV positive. I don't live with the AIDS virus in that way. But I will say that, you know, myself, my friends, my gay male friends, my queer friends, my partner, there is this kind of implicitness which sometimes comes with HIV and AIDS that kind of is instilled as a fear, you know, that it could still happen to us because we're gay men, you know. And I think that is kind of, I don't know what that means, but again, if you go, you know, for an STI test, I think there's an interesting dialogue which kind of is very helpful, you know. Have you had an HIV test, for instance? That's what the nurse might ask you. And you say no. She's like, are you a gay man? Yes. Well, you should. Of course you should. But I think that there's this kind of inbuilt still fear, shame, and particularly when we think of the closet and this assumption that, okay, everyone's out, everyone's gay. Of course they're not. It's not like that, you know? So I think there's still work to be done.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I think as well, you're right about not everybody being out. For some people, that is a daily struggle for them, you know, trying to work out how they're going to navigate their life, their day. For some people, it might be religious reasons, you know, they can't reconcile their faith with being gay. There's so many things that come into this. And I think it's really interesting what you mentioned there about, you know, going to see a nurse, because even when you go to get your blood taken and to donate blood, they ask these types of questions and they're quite intrusive, really. And it makes you wonder, is the hidden message that you're dirty? Is that what they're saying? You know, it's hard sometimes to try and see what the real message is. And I'm wondering, have you felt maybe not included or separated, or there's been a time where you haven't felt that there was a space for you?
In terms of HIV and AIDS, or just in terms of gay, LGBT?
I think more the LGBT element, but that sort of feeling like what you do is wrong, or you don't have a right to be here, or you are these sorts of things. Yeah,
I mean that's why I asked, you know, to kind of just to qualify that in terms of, I think we need to be quite cautious and careful about simply conflating HIV and AIDS with gay masculinity or gay male life. But again, I think just one thing to build on that, because I just scribbled it down, is that, you know, when I was talking in the last segment, I was thinking about kind of shame in the closet and myself. And this kind of idea, like you say, that, you know, if you use these multiple contexts of, okay, if you are, you know, of a particular religious domination and you discover that you're gay and you can't come out, for instance, I think there's an assumption, and a very, very powerful, actually, and I think it comes through the media, not just mass media, but also social media, and we're generating this mediations of the self. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, wherever. It comes through other things like, for instance, pornography, reality television, all kinds of places where youth is the kind of driver of everything, you know, and this kind of idea that, you know, if a beautiful young man of 19 contracts AIDS, which many beautiful young men did and still do, that's the kind of emblematic thing. If you pick up gay male magazines and open things to do with HIV and AIDS awareness, it's often, you know, guys who really do look like they're porn stars or fashion models, not guys who are, for instance, people of colour or older men. And I'm using masculinity as an example, but that's not the only example. So I think there's a problematic representational construction around that. But to broaden it out, I think that there's also a problematic representational construction around LGBTQ+++++, and this kind of idea of feeling like you have to always kind of, I'm thinking of it's a quotation actually from a gay male kind of academic, but it's very knowable. It's not too complicated. There's a gay male scholar called Lee Edelman, and he talks about gay masculinity particularly, but I think you can lift and shift this to any marginalized group. He says that gay men always have to bear the burden of the representation that they represent. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's this idea that I have to always be gay. So again, Edelman's saying, like, you know, you walk in the room, it's like, hi, I'm Gareth, I'm gay. You know, you might not even say it, but there's clearly something which needs to be articulated. When I teach my students, I kind of say to them, and this is not to in any way kind of, you know, undermine heterosexual peers and counterparts, but it's quite rare, isn't it, you know, to actually say to your parents, well, by the way, I'm straight, you know, or to actually have to qualify your straightness to someone. It's assumed. So I think any personality trait or any state of being, actually, we say this with mental health, we say this with well-being, and we say this, you know, the example for today's HIV and AIDS, but we see this way that we have to, as a marginalised person or subculture or group, however you want to say it, we always have to kind of self-profess or self-proclaim. And I think the whole move towards things like, for instance, the language of protected characteristics, the language of pronouns, is an interesting response to that. So, hell yeah, I've always felt like I'm on the kind of periphery or the parameters. I've been fortunate enough, and I don't know where it came from, and bold enough to always be a bit cheeky, a bit outspoken, to kind of, I don't know, like the subversive potential for actually saying in front of a group of straight guys, yeah, I'm gay. But again, that doesn't come easily, and it didn't come easily. You know, sticking your two fingers up or answering back is really difficult. It's really, really difficult to do. So I think that if you spoke to any marginalised person or any marginalised subject, and you know what? I think we're all marginalised. I'm not going to pick on straight white men here, because straight white men are marginalised in some ways. They have traits which are, you know, if we talk about mental health and well-being, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done there. But I think we're all vulnerable, we're all marginalised, we're all anxious. All of this stuff, which is thankfully now much more open to kind of discussion, needs to just be opened up to actually say, well, we can work with our vulnerabilities, we can work with our anxieties, we can work with our doubts and empower each other through them, rather than actually dwelling on this kind of ridiculous, redundant discourse of shame and silence, which has, you know, and let's be honest about this, which has destroyed and killed full communities of people in whatever way. So yeah, I think that if you speak to anyone, not just a gay, queer, marginalised person, everyone's dealing with that in their own contextual way. It's structures that you've got available to you that you use and you manage and you kind of negotiate. I think also, though, just last bit, that the great thing about being gay or being queer is that you can, in a way that maybe our straight counterparts maybe can't, you can subvert and question and renegotiate the kind of lines of what is, you know, acceptable and what is unacceptable. There's endless debates, isn't there, about stuff like gay parenting or gay marriage, those kinds of things where, you know, radically queer people would say, why would we want to have kids? Why would we want to get married? We're queer, we want to be subversive, we want to be different. And then others would say, well, actually, I want some of that. You know, I want stability, I want the conventions. I'm indifferent. I think go with what you feel, you know. And then again, I think we need to move towards, I think we kind of get there, but then we don't. Move towards a space where what works for you is the kind most important and subjectively empowering thing that can possibly happen, you know.
Absolutely, thank you. It's really interesting to hear what you've been saying there, and also hearing your experience and feeling not included sometimes. And actually, I know we've said the word marginalised a lot today.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to explain that, so I know what that means,
yeah.
But some listeners might not.
I mean, if you're on the margins of something, you're on the edges of something, so you're not included. You're the kid in the playground on the side. So you're on the sidelines, you know? And that is, if you use that metaphor, I was always the kid that never wanted to play football, but would say to the team, and isn't that a cliche, you know? But I would always kind of say, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not. Because I answered back, I was cheeky. But again, if you are the kid that's being forced, for whatever reason, and again, football's a silly example, but it kind of it can hopefully help the listeners visualize it. If you're on the sidelines, if you're on the margins, you're excluded somehow. And again, that exclusion can often happen, and often does happen, against your will. You don't choose to be excluded. You're born into exclusion. And again, that's hard to then overcome, to get into. So that could be connected to anything like your sexuality, your social class, your race, your bodily ability or disability, as the case may be. There's a kind of term, again, which is being used widely both in academic circles but outside, which is intersectionality. This idea that those intersections of the marginalised crisscross. So you're not only just one thing, so it's, if I said, well, I'm a gay man, it's like, well, how do you identify in terms of your social class? What does that mean as a 40-year-old gay man, as opposed to, it's endless, But yeah, just to go back, I think margins are those things which are on the edges or on the periphery. You're kind of excluded, and it's how you negotiate the margins. So it's kind of like, you might say, it's being on the kind of skids, or being, outside of something. Another term which is banned, disenfranchised, powerless.
And it's really powerful when you say that, powerless, because you realise how strongly that feeling will be for people who are marginalised or who are on the outside. I would like to ask you, Gareth, about labels. So as the world is getting smaller in many ways, and we have so much information available to us now, there is so many more conversations happening now. I find it fascinating. I love psychology. I love watching people, and I love equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it's interesting because I've been speaking to my friends recently about watching the show Friends, the sitcom. Mm-hmm. And actually, we can't watch it. It's really quite inappropriate to watch now. It's really homophobic and transphobic. And some of the jokes, it's sexist, but times have changed dramatically since it first came out. And there are so many new things to see and to learn about on TV now, but also in conversations at schools and things like this. So I did want to ask, given that you're an academic in many different disciplines, but also very active in equality and diversity and inclusion, what is your view personally on labels, and do you find them helpful? So when we label ourselves with these, as you said there, you will always be a man, but you always will think of yourself as a gay man. And it's like other guests we've had on the show have said, when people see me, they see me as a black woman, not a woman. So do you feel that, or what are your thoughts around those labels? Are they helpful, or are they empowering, or are they a hindrance? I'm really curious.
I think they're both. If I manage how I see the world, it's if we go back to something like we mentioned disempowerment or feeling powerless, that's always got to have a relationship to power, right? So there's always a tension. That's what I'm going to say. So if you think about a label, what else do we have? We're confined by language structures, and we're confined by organizational structures. So again, if you think of this in a contemporary equality, diversity and inclusion setting, there are lots of discussions and debates around, for instance, pronouns. There are lots of discussions and debates around, for instance, toilet spaces. Lots of discussions and debates around, for example, how I choose to self-define myself, i.e. my protected characteristics. And one could argue with that whole thing where we're kind of in the eye of the EDI storm a bit, that I chair a network at Newcastle University called the Rainbow Network, which is a staff and a postgraduate research student network. And it's a fantastic thing. It's really one of the reasons I've got really fired up in the last few years again about kind of LGBT, rights and politics, not just in the workplace, but everywhere. But again, that's to the side for now. I think what I'm trying to say with labels is that they're always going to be there. We can't completely and utterly discount them. I mean, there was a moment, actually, if we go back to HIV and AIDS, there was a moment, and I don't think we're post-HIV or post-AIDS, but there was a moment after the 1980s, the huge crisis of the 1980s, where things seemed to slow a little bit in the US and the UK, but they didn't slow as such. They came to slow is actually the wrong way to put it. They slowed in terms of kind of, if you like, the media whipping up a frenzy, and then they returned again, particularly in this country through the Section 28 Thatcher era. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of people began to respond to the confinement that labels instilled on them in the late 80s and early 90s, and it's often referred to as the queer moment. So this idea that this term queer could encompass or move us to a place where labels didn't matter anymore. So, for example, this idea of, groups like, for instance, Speak Out or Outrage, who were and still are to an extent, in their new kind of incarnations, very, very radical political movements that intervened under this banner of queer. What we find with those movements and this movement called queer and this term queer is that it offers a huge amount of possibility as to how we might self-define ourselves. And I think we're still working that out. But what we also find with queer is that queer in itself then becomes a label. And it's kind of like, how can that, be a thing? For me, queer is less of a kind of person and a body. It's more of a way of seeing the world or thinking. So it's about negotiating something. I haven't said that really very clearly. What I'm driving towards there is how labels, he, him, she, her, gay, straight, black, white, whatever, right? They're always in relation, I think, to the norms and structures of a particular space, place and time. So when you mention Friends, yeah, I agree with you. But that's not really anyone's fault. That show is produced at a particular time in relation to a particular, set of norms and structures in a particular geography and a politics, that you can't look into a crystal ball and go, okay, yeah, in 10 years' time, we're going to be doing this, or in 15 years' time, we're going to be doing that. I do think, though, just to kind of knit things together for today, I think with the HIV/AIDS theme and then this idea of queer, particularly in a kind of UK-US frame, really kind of begins to put a cat amongst the pigeons in the late 80s, early 90s in response to the levels of oppression and discrimination that people experienced under, governments such as Margaret Thatcher's, Ronald Reagan's, which kind of connected to the stigmatization and the hystericization of gay people and that way of the body being HIV positive or infected with AIDS. So again, queer is a very radical political response. It's a big two fingers up to everything. And it's a big two fingers up when you drill into it. I would see myself as, again, an academic term, a queer theorist. There's a big body of academic work called queer theory. And queer questions the status quo. It questions the norms. It questions the labels. It forces us to look again. So queer, if we were sitting here 40 years ago, maybe even to some of the listeners, I know that I've done a series of workshops with older LGBT people and they find queer still offensive. They don't like the term. Queer is one of those terms that's a kind of term of reclamation. So it's a really derogatory term, which in some domains, particularly from the late 80s, early 90s, people begin to reclaim, and say, well, actually, if you've called us queer, we're going to call ourselves queer. That's who we are. So I think labels will not go anywhere. I think they're always going to kind of maintain some sort of governmental status quo unless we descend into a state of anarchy. That's for another day. But yeah, I think that, it's that whole, again, with an EDI frame, it's that, and it drives me towards the kind of issues facing trans subjects and trans people, where, if we look at an application form or a passport or a library card, it's kind of like you've got to be Mr. or Miss, So I think that we are moving through that. But I know from my work, even with the Rainbow Network at the university, it's a really, really complex sort of setting. If you think of the kind of, the superficiality of a gender neutral toilet, or an all gender toilet rather, or the superficiality of, well, I've had colleagues, why has he got he, him on his signature? And it's difficult to explain it sometimes, there needs to be a much better level, I think, of conversation, openness and dialogues about how we're self-defining and how we're defined, you know. I was wearing a badge the other day and it said he, him. And it was from, there was a really brilliant Trans Awareness Week, you know, last week at the uni because of Transgender Day of Remembrance and all of that. And I was given this badge by the LGBT chair of the NUSU, and he kind of said, "Oh, Gareth, I've brought you this badge, and it says he, him," and I was really pleased with it, you know, and it was kind of on my lanyard. And a couple of colleagues in meetings kind of, not in a derogatory way, just said, what does that mean? We know you're a bloke, what? And I kind of was explaining, and then they were like, "Oh, actually, that's really interesting." But that's going to take time, you know, and I never lose sight of the fact that I'm working within a privileged framework, a kind of academic queer theory, queer politics framework. And if I, you know, just walk onto the street and start to talk to people about this, that doesn't, you know, they've got other things to worry about. So, yeah, labels are things which I think are using that example of queer, I think labels can be reclaimed by the self. I think they can be subverted and reclaimed in a way that if you feel empowered with the label that you've self-defined, more power to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I like that. I'm really glad you've explained the word queer, because I have myself heard it used, but also felt cautious about using it because it's not my place to take that word or use it. It's not my story. It's not my word to claim. And it's really interesting because I hang out with a lot of different people from all walks of life. And I found it interesting, the differing views on things like pride. So over the last few years, I've noticed a lot of my friends who are gay or LGBTQ and have said, actually, we don't want to support Pride anymore because it's not what it used to be. It's not about the history. It's about commercialization. It's about buying lots of drinks and a party. Yeah. And that's really curious to me because it's such an important day in many people's calendar. So it's curious to know, as you said, intersectionality. Everybody has different views. You can't just decide that someone has a label and then they're always going to act in the same way, or they're going to like the same things, or they will like that because they have that particular characteristic, or, you know, we're all still so very unique. And actually that intersectionality is very important. For yourself, do you tend to go to Pride? Have you got any views on Pride?
Yeah, I've got loads of views on Pride. Yes, I mean, it's an interesting thing. Okay, so if I don't want to speak about myself because it's not about that, but I used so just let's use that word, that go back to that queer thing. So I used the term queer for a number of years, and I knew why I was using it, but again, I think I was betraying myself because I wasn't actually queer. I wasn't subjectively embodying or behave. Not that you behave, but I'm a gay man. And again, I would say that gay masculinity and the way that I lead my life and the way that I present myself and how I exist is connected to a gay male type or a gay male kind of mode of being in the world, right? So from that, my relationship with Pride is a very gay male one at a personal level. So if I take my academic hat off, if I take my hat off and I'm just me with my mates, it's us as a bunch of gay men in our 30s and 40s going to Pride to have a laugh, to celebrate, to march, and to do things as I get older, probably in a way that I did them in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I have a view of Pride, and again, it's about your age and your structure and your framework of reference on a personal, but also to kind of bring it back to a broader kind of cultural level, which sees Pride now as it is a highly commercialized, commodified thing. If we think about the second decade of the 21st century, anything which, and I think this is a very sort of capitalist thing, so the USA, Australia, you know, advanced societies, Europe, anything which I think maybe started out as small and subversive and politically charged eventually ends up being branded and commodified and kind of smoothed over. And I think to some extent, Pride has become that in some quarters. So if one wants to do a big critique of London Pride and look at, you know, the key, let's use that language, investors and stakeholders, if you go to London Pride, which I do every year, you've got at the front of the Pride Parade, Disney, Virgin Money, Barclays Bank, all of that. That's the world we live in. We don't live in this world where we can nostalgically look back to the GLF, which is the Gay Liberation Front in the early 70s, and have 50 people marching through Soho with their tops off and, you know, handmade banners. It looks really sexy in a black and white photograph. We see it through this nostalgic lens of the kind of, you know, the proximate past, if you will. But again, that is no longer Pride in the West. I think that those prides are happening, but they're happening in non-Western contexts now. And I think that Pride in itself has almost become part of a bigger picture, whereby anything which is potentially subversive, anything which is potentially kind of different or unique or authentic or small scale, do it yourself, is automatically Instagrammable or automatically commodified. So if people can make money, they're going to make money. It's kind of like, you know, if you can stage a Pride event and you can get gay male favourite diva from somewhere, you know, I wasn't there, but when Britney Spears appeared in Brighton a few years ago, one of my mates was down there and she, straight mate actually, an ally, and a couple of her gay friends, and she just said it was astounding just how the kind of hysteria was being whipped up. She felt like she was at like a kind of, at some sort of teenage concert, that it was, you know, you could not get moved, you couldn't get a drink, you couldn't, all of that. And yeah, I think if that's what you want, fine. But I do think that particularly, I mean, if you look at the Northeast, for example, you've got Pride, which again, I attend and I enjoy. But then you've got other alternatives. You've got, for instance, something like, for example, the Curious Arts Festival, which uses this idea of the alternative, which in itself is not without its problems, because it sort of pitches two things as oppositional when they shouldn't be. But I think we are at that moment where there's a lot of, probably from people like you and I, a responsiveness where we see ourselves as maybe not more informed, but we don't want to, you know, go to the exhibition park or the Tamwa and you know, get mortal drunk and watch a kind of reality TV star on the stage. If that's your thing, great. But if it's not your thing, there should be other spaces. That's what I'm trying to say. So I think Pride is one of those things that has become this highly commodified brand in large urban spaces. Some of the more interesting prides, you could argue, I mean, in this region, I think it was last year, forgive me if I'm incorrect here, but there was Northumberland Pride, for example. So this idea that, you know, gay people are always urban and metropolitan and, you know, live in big city sprawls like Brighton or Manchester or Leeds, Newcastle, London. Rural prides are kind of interesting things because you're thinking, well, okay, who's going to come out for this? Who's going to actually engage with this? I didn't attend, I have to admit, but certainly this year I'm looking to go. It was in Alnwick, and I had a few friends that did, and they were like, it was really interesting in terms of the kind of the approach that they took as opposed to the big pride festivals. Gay men particularly, and I think gay masculinity, not as a kind of lived thing, but as an industry, are behind this kind of quite amplified version of Pride, where Pride becomes this sellable thing. So if you can put the rainbow flag onto anything, which it is on anything, then you can sell it. You know, it reminds me, this is completely off track, but it reminds me of the way in which someone like, it's kind of like the way in which graffiti's been commodified. It's like Banksy. You know, it's like if you do something incredibly original and subversive, it doesn't take long for capitalism to eat it up, vomit it back out and rebrand it as a product. And in some ways, that's where I think we are. That sounds very depressing. But I think that with the bigger Pride events, they're driven in that way, if that makes sense.
It It's a very interesting perspective. I myself love Pride. I march every year, and my best friend Sarah and I go, and we love it. And the sense of solidarity and being an ally, and it's just wonderful. But I do think as well, what you spoke about spaces before, and the curious arts space, and there being different spaces, and I think that's really important. But I think one of the big things with any of these types of festivals or events is it's great to be an ally, but at the same time sometimes you can take up other people's space, and I think that's a really important thing to think about for anybody looking at being more inclusive, and just wondering sometimes, is this the right space for you to be in? That's something I try and keep a check on for myself all the time as well. I'm very mindful of the time, so I just wanted to check 2 things. So first of all, I would love to know, has there been a book or anything like that that's really helped you in your journey, or that you would like to recommend?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I'm not going to go for an academic book. Okay, so there are loads of queer theoretical books that I could use, but one of the pitfalls of being an academic is that as you read more and more, it becomes more difficult to kind of get pleasure from reading. But if I think of a kind of seminal book that completely, so there are 2. There is, and they're very gay male, and they're both novels. So there's the novel by a guy called Larry Kramer called Faggots, which speaks to the HIV and AIDS kind of theme for today. This unbelievably beautiful, I read it in one sitting, I think, and I actually did, I'm not romanticising that, when I was doing my MA in London, I was about 21, 22 when I encountered it, had this beautiful cover of a kind of Caravaggio painting, and faggots, I mean, that word in itself is really problematic, right? This was published in the late 70s, and it's a capture of pre-AIDS culture in New York. And it's a capture of the New York scene, which again has been totally sentimentalized. But it's, you get entire chapters with beautiful, very, very kind of specific musical references in them. And I remember reading that book and then seeking out these records, which really existed, and listening to them and absolutely becoming obsessed with kind of, quite rare disco music that these gay men would have listened to. And it's this capture of a very beautiful, promiscuous, almost kind of utopian culture, which probably never existed, but in itself really kind of changed my perspective and thought, this is really empowering, so that Larry Kramer's Faggots. The other one is Edmund White, who is a really well-respected, very well-known gay male author, and it's called A Boy's Own Story. And again, A Boy's Own Story is this beautiful capture of not just a coming out narrative, but it really, spoke to me in terms of, and I read it well after I'd come out, but it spoke to me in terms of the kinds of feelings that lots of, and I will use that term, it's not just queer, this could connect, if you identified it as a lesbian subject, maybe some of those things to do with the closet, some of those feelings that you have about being on the margins, very, very clearly there. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, but there's a wealth of, and I still continue, to read LGBTQ plus literature. It's probably the only literature I read, actually. So yeah, they would be the 2.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And my favorite question of every show is, what is your number 1 word that you like to use to help you nurture your zest?
My favorite, it's the one that comes to mind. So again, and people who know me, my partner particularly knows this, I really love the word exquisite. So I think that exquisite, if you are exquisite, or if something is exquisite, then it's worth kind of capturing or retaining. I love that word.
That's beautiful. It makes me think of my favourite word, which is not zest, although that is one of my favourites. But I love the word flamboyance. I'm obsessed with flamingos. And the plural of a flamingo is a flamboyance. So I love that. We shall finish now and go and be exquisite.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to Nurture Your Zest. You can find us online on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn at Nurture Your Zest. If you've liked today, please subscribe. You can also leave us a review if you're feeling extra kind. Today's podcast has been made available through the kind sponsorship of TL Multimedia and That Branding Company. We look forward to catching up with you again soon as you learn to nurture your zest.